Welcome again, everybody, to our seminar series, Digital Rules and Human Values. Thank you for those who've managed to attend. We are doing this series, of course, from GIDE, where our focus is on people-focused digital economy and data rules, and doing this in collaboration with CG, the Global Solutions Initiative, and with my data label from Europe. I'd like to remind people that this session is recorded and we'll have an opportunity for people to ask questions at the end. If you do not wish your face to appear in the questions and you want to remain anonymous, please just write your questions into the chat group and we'll ask the questions from there. Otherwise, if you do ask a question, you'll come up on the video. I would like to welcome anybody who's new to the session and remind you that we have a channel on YouTube, Digital Rules, Human Values, where we bring up our seminars from each time. There's a whole series of them, which is a combination of people talking from the policy side and also from the practitioner's side about how do you actually implement a people-focused data governance. I'd particularly like to welcome Guilherme Canela from UNESCO, who's joining us. And in terms of William comes with both of these. He has a lot of practitioner as well as a lot of policy married into what he does. He's the director of the Division for Digital Inclusion and Policies and Digital Transformation in UNESCO, which is quite a long job title. We're looking forward to hearing what that means. And is going to speak quite specifically about data governance in the digital age, AI in the public sector, and some of the other things that UNESCO helps to coordinate. He's got a fascinating portfolio, so we'll get started. Just start with something a bit personal before we get into the stuff. How did you get to UNESCO, and I suppose why UNESCO? Because you obviously got a lot of talents.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you for introduction, Paul. Actually, it's quite interesting story because in the beginning of my career in Brazil, I'm Brazilian, I worked in a very unusual line of work that was the protection of freedom of expression of children, which until today it's a big story, right? How you guarantee the articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that they also are entitled to freedom of expression. And it was actually a Latin American think tank working in several countries in the region, although from headquarters in Brazil. So I worked many years on that area, and then eventually there was an international process to become the UNESCO's person for these issues of freedom of expression, first in the Brasilia office and later for the entire Latin America and the Caribbean. So that was a bit the path, moving from the freedom of expression of children to a broader discussion on freedom of expression, access to information, first in Latin America and then globally. After that, the Director General asked me to move to this function that is still connected with the main topic of access to information, but looking into the specific connections with technologies and the information society and so on.
Yeah, good. It's always interesting paths people take, as you say, the children. As an Australian, the question of protection of children's rights of expression or their rights not to watch certain things online is a sort of topical, very topical subject. You've been doing a lot of work where you are in UNESCO, and UNESCO as a whole has been doing a lot of work on artificial intelligence. And as you know, at the moment, we've got a particular focus on AI in our seminar series. Perhaps it'd be good for you to share a little bit of that. And obviously, you're doing a lot of work with governments as well as with others on sort of AI empowerment or AI understanding. So it'd be interesting to get your sense of, the key things you think you need to work on.
Sure. I will, since this is being recorded and people can watch also this later, I will share a presentation.
Yeah, good.
Also, because there are some QR codes in the presentation that people can access the materials later on. So are you seeing that?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, super. So a bit of context from the perspective of the normative instruments and so on. Obviously, in UNESCO, we are the organization in the UN system in charge of promoting and protecting the free flow of information and ideas. This particular phrase is written in our constitution that was approved in November 1945. So everything we do in this area of technologies that can impact the information ecosystem is basically because of this mandate that the member states assigned to UNESCO back then in 1945. I mean, this is the core business to protect the free flow of information and ideas. But fast forwarding to more recent developments, UNESCO was kind of pioneering in negotiating or helping to negotiate among the member states the first international instrument in the AI era, that is this 2021 recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which after several rounds of negotiation was approved in a consensus manner by our then 193 member states. And immediately after this normative instrument was agreed, the organization started looking into the impacts of this conversation to broader of our relevant stakeholders, in this case, the governments. One particular important issue was the launching of this program on AI and the public sector, particularly how the different areas of the executive branch of governments should start taking strategic decisions in terms of incorporating or not artificial intelligence in their policy making and policy delivery. And similarly, at the same time, and based on an older program that we had on another area, we launched a similar idea for that's called AI and rule of law, that's more dedicated to the work with the judiciary system, which I would be not entering too much details this time, but we might have this conversation in the future. So in terms of our work with the public sector, overall, when we are engaging in this kind of frameworks, we are looking into these different, let's say, pillars of cooperation. One is raising awareness about the topic, so lots of investment on that. And then there is a standard setting function with the parameters established by that recommendation that I referred to, but then you need to go in details of what does that mean in practice, for example, for the education sector or for the health sector or for the culture sector and so on. Then there is more straightforward political recommendations in this area for these different stakeholders, strong component of capacity building in many different avenues of what capacity building is related to. And then, of course, stimulation of international cooperation, strong emphasis in global south or south-south cooperation, but obviously north-south and triangular cooperation is part of what we try to do when we are designing and implementing this kind of comprehensive programs. So in the specific discussion of AI and digital transformation, because obviously the discussion of the day, if you will, is artificial intelligence. But first, there are many areas of digital transformation that are still behind in terms of the more updated discussion on artificial intelligence, but also there are things we are already discussing with public sector that is beyond the discussion of artificial intelligence. For example, we have started a lot of discussions already on the implications of quantum technology for the public sector, for example, in terms of what is happening with encryption or might happen with encryption and so on in this area. So just to say that our view is broader, it's not only about AI, it's a conversation on digital transformation, which includes AI and different other things. So the important story here is that what we tried to do also under the umbrella of the Broadband Commission was to discuss with the governments themselves, in this case, the people in charge of rethinking the role of civil servants in a scenario like that. So in partnership with them to develop a comprehensive framework for what does that mean for civil servants to act in this new era of AR and the challenges on digital transformation. So we did some conversations with some of these institutions that is here in the screen, European Union, also some piloting conversations in India and Rwanda and Nigeria and so on. And this helped us to format the program that I will be explaining with a bit more of details in the next minutes. So the first story obviously was to look in a logic of needs assessment, and also what were the barriers that these different areas of the public sector were identifying in advancing with the overall digital transformation in general, but AI in particular. And no big surprises on the headlines, right? There are cultural and organization barriers that needs to be overcome to advance on that. A lot of data and infrastructure barriers growing with the AI story. In recent you can see years not only under the United Nations system, but also in caucus like G20 or BRICS, a strong conversation about digital public infrastructure, et cetera, the lack of it for the implementation of this kind of transformation. And luckily, a strong perception of the public sector that the key component in terms of data and infrastructure barriers is the lack of actually comprehensive frameworks, for example, in the area of data governance. This kind of conversation in Africa, for example, is very, very clear that they understand that this is a need that needs to be accelerated in terms of, for example, structures in terms of data governance and so on. And then obviously the human resource capacity and the gaps in that area, which have a strong possibility to unfortunately enhance inequalities in the overall distribution of this type of policy if they are not addressed. And then it goes from skills, from capacities of data analysis, to things like, for example, how these language models cope or do not cope with the plurality of languages in a particular jurisdiction, for example. So this, in a nutshell, were the barriers that were identified when we started the conversation with the public sector to then generate, under, as I said, the umbrella of the Broadband Commission, this comprehensive framework for competences for civil servants in this of the digital transformation. So as you can see, the framework also to address the dialogue with the barriers was established under these three pillars: digital planning and designing. So lots of what was done there is to go deeper in this particular conversation, and then data use and data governance and digital management, because also there was a strong, let's say, request to look into the average civil servant in the different areas of government, but also how we could discuss this with senior leadership in the different areas of government, so a mix of the two types of stakeholders and actors. I won't enter into these very small letters, but this to have a in a glance that the idea is in each one of those pillars to go deeper in what are the competences inside of the civil servant or the public sector that would be necessary to advance in digital planning and design, in data governance and so on. And I will be back later, particularly on the example of data governance with some extra elements on that. So another parallel conversation on regarding this implementation of this framework is obviously related to the attitudes within the public sector that are important to be taken into consideration to advance this in a positive manner. So you'll see that the different tools, and some of them I will show in the coming slides, that we have been developing together with the public sector actors, but also with our partners like Oxford University, etc., is very much based on how we can stimulate these different in the reshaping of the public sector, and particularly the capacities of the public sector in absorbing, implementing, adapting, etc., localizing digital transformation and AI. And of course, all these key elements here: trust, creativity, adaptability, curiosity, experimentation, were key words and key areas that were part of our process in developing these with the relevant actors. So a very concrete example of this is this massive training tool that we developed with Oxford University under the umbrella of an alliance that I will explain in a minute, that is called the Spark Alliance of National Schools of Public Administration and Government. This is, let's say, I guess, an interesting story because beyond what I'm going to explain, that what are the contents, how the course was, due to the strong interest of civil servants all over the world, what we are having now is a very interesting feedback as well on the things that work, things that are missing, and so on. So it's a constant improvement, also because this thing is moving in such a fast pace that having this permanent dialogue with the relevant stakeholders is a particularly important element to advance. So as you can see here, it's a tool that is looking into practical skills, strategic tools, and the elements of ethical frameworks and global case studies to further develop this conversation. We were very careful in having faculty from all the regions, from Asia, Pacific, Africa, Arab states, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Europe and North America. So it's really a course that offers a comparative perspective on the challenges being faced in these different regions by the public sector in incorporating, implementing the new technologies, including AI, in the public sector. So you'll see the conversation, that the tool is divided in these 6 modules. So it starts with foundations of digital transformation and AI, then a strong conversation about data governance. For us, an essential point is how all of this is and should be anchored in human rights and ethics of AI, then the specific governance for trustworthy AI and digital systems, then a specific discussion on designing. One of the important elements is also the procurement policies of the public sector, how they are actually deciding to buy this kind of technologies or to develop themselves, and then a more leadership component for digital transformation in the governance. So this is the overall structure of this. That again, one important aspect is that this is not developed only by us here, bureaucrats in Paris looking into this, was very much a peer process developed with the National Schools of Public Administration and taking a lot in consideration what were their concerns in terms of the overall capacity building of civil servants. So you can see that the response of the civil servants, the public sector all over the world was quite massive. This tool was launched a few months ago, and you can see that more than 35,000 students, civil servants from 192 countries are enrolled in this massive online course, and growing because we started with English and Spanish. Very recently, we launched Portuguese and French, and very soon we are going to launch in Arabic. So it's growing in a very interesting pace, and the reaction and the feedback of the students is quite interesting in terms of how useful this is, at least as an introductory conversation for this type of discussion in the public sector. And then a note on how this was produced, because I think this is particularly relevant. Launched 1 year ago in parallel with all this process. This alliance called Spark Alliance, it stands for Schools of Public Administration and Knowledge Institutions. But basically, what we want to do is to create a sustainable process in terms of capacity building in the public sector. So identifying which are the institutions in our 193 member states that are officially in charge of the capacity building of civil servants across the board, and make sure that what we are doing here can remain, and then they can further translate these in the curricula that is used to pre-service and in-service training of civil servants. And we hope this then will continue regardless of UNESCO's engagement or not. But what we are trying to do here is something that's not one training process in a given point in time. Is something that will be then absorbed by those institutions that are in charge of training civil servants all over the world. I think it's paying off today. National institutions from more than 110 countries are already connected with this alliance, and we are receiving every day new expressions of interest to advance this. So this, in a nutshell, the program for the public sector. We have been discussing here with Paul and Vicente the possibility of having a different conversation in the future, specifically dedicated to this point of AI and rule of law, because the conversation about digital transformation in general, but AI in particular in the judiciary system, is quite different of the rest of the public sector, though of course there are common grounds. But I will just give a teaser here on our work in this area, because this work with the judges and the prosecutors, for many reasons, is a bit more advanced than the overall work with the public sector. So we had several lessons learned from the work with the judiciary in order to advance the work with the other areas of the public sector. And one of the things is that we have a massive network of judges and prosecutors, more than 50,000 judicial operators already engaged with us in different areas of our program that we call the Judges Initiative. And we did a survey just after the launch of the chats in 2023, if I'm the current versions of the. It was very interesting to notice that very rapidly a significant amount of the judicial operators were already using artificial intelligence in their daily work, but only 9% of those users were saying that they had any sort of training regarding this, which is a huge gap in terms of what is happening in the use of this kind of technology and the actual specific capacity building, in this case for the judiciary. So based on this long-standing program that has more than a decade now, that's called the UNESCO Judges Initiative, we have established a very strong conversation with the members of the judiciary all over the world to develop this specific program on AI and rule of law. And very recently, we launched it again in consultation with Supreme Courts in different parts of the world, etc., these guidelines for the use of AI systems in courts and tribunals, with a very interesting acceptance by the judiciary. Some Supreme Courts are actually issuing decisions requesting the judiciary to use these UNESCO guidelines, etc., etc. But the point here, because I wanted to connect with the discussion on AI and public sector, is that these 15 principles that we have been discussing for a while now with the judiciary, although they have specificities, obviously, in the conversation with the judges and the prosecutors, they are principles that are also illuminating or enlightening the discussion we have with the public sector. So, for example, protection of human rights, how we do the feasibility of the benefits, the safety in the conversation, the information security, the accuracy and reliability, the explainability. Although when we look into the specificities of each one of those principles for the judiciary, there are lots of conditions that apply to that part, that the particular area of government or that particular branch of government. But each one of those principles, they have also implications for the broader conversation with the public sector. So we are also expanding this conversation as well. So that's why you can see here in a very briefly that there is a strong conversation with courts all over the world. This is just a map of 2025, last year, of trainings that happened all over the world with courts and the national schools of judges on this particular issue of artificial intelligence. Now, to conclude, there are a few issues that for us are cross-cutting issues in this conversation. Either it is with the public sector overall, of the judiciary sector in particular. That is the issues related to data governance and a few others that I will mention in a minute. So the first one, we are always emphasizing in our conversations, again, with the public sector or with the judges and so on, that we need to pay a lot of attention on the environmental impacts of these technologies, particularly AI, because they are not minor. On the contrary, as you know, the impacts in the consumption of energy and water and critical minerals is particularly relevant. So we have been developing, among others, with the University College of London, very specific guidance and models to show how this impact can be mitigated, reduced, and what are the kinds of choices, which is also very much related to procurement decisions that the public sector must do in order to mitigate, reduce the environmental impacts of these technologies, and hence the decisions that governments take in this area. So this is a cross-cutting element that we are including in our different tools, either with the public sector or the judiciary. The other important thing is data governance. And so in a similar methodology with the overall work with the public sector, also under the umbrella of the Broadband Commission, we have developed the global toolkit for data governance and AI, looking in the entire cycle, the entire life cycle of the data governance, from the way that the data is first extracted, the decision in collecting it, to all the process of records management and so on. And this is generating a huge interest of our member states on how to further apply this kind of conversation in their own decisions or decision-making processes regarding this. So you can see here how this is being deployed all over the world. There is a particular interest in the African region about this topic, and different countries have already been in partnership with us for the deployment of this data governance toolkit. We do that in partnership with the World Bank, with Smart Africa, and several other partners in the overall international community ecosystem. So I will stop here. The idea was to offer a bit what we have been doing, what are the different tools, but glad to then start a conversation and going into more details if needed.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that. I don't know how you do that and still get sleep. The things to do. Perhaps we can open up to questions. I mean, it's the amount of work you've been doing and the UNESCO as a whole has been doing in this area is notable. And, with our interest, our community's interest about, focusing on the people at the center of the economy, I think that's important. So if anybody's got any questions or would like to make any comments, they'd be very welcome to do so. While people are actually doing that thinking, it is the blessing and the curse of the multilateral organizations, but the degree of interest in your maps has a consistency of being emerging economies and poorer economies, which makes a lot of sense in many respects. How do you find the gap, managing the gap between the advanced frontier part of this space, especially with AI, with the needs of addressing that audience? I mean, is there a gap? Do people, both in terms of the content and the things that people worry about, and particularly, I suppose, in terms of attention, I would expect some, China and the United States may not be waiting for the next UNESCO report, which may be true or may not be true. You can persuade me of that. But I'm just interested, is there a dissonance between the two parts?
Well, I would say it's less than other areas that the digital transformation that we worked in the past, where it was a clear difference between the demands of emerging economies and it could be called developed countries and so on. I would say in the discussions about AI, for example, we are a knowledge partner of the J20, that is the caucus of the Supreme Courts of the G20 countries. And their meeting in Johannesburg last year, in September, the chief justices of the majority of those countries were present. And the discussions about AI were very similar, regardless if it was a global South country or a global North country in that respect. So similar to other types of conversation in this area, recently, I don't know how many of the people either with us today or watching this video followed the UN AI governance dialogue in Geneva a few weeks ago. The statement of the ministers and heads of states, they are all publicly available in the website of the UN dialogue. And you'll see a lot of coincidence between the statements of the different economies. So there is an overall preoccupation with data governance, with the different areas of capacities, with multilingualism and large language models. So in that sense, I would say that I see less gaps than we saw in the past. Now, what is really different is the access to the resources. So the conversation is also a conversation about how to fund all of these. And I see a stronger preoccupation, for example, with data governance in the global south that I see in parts of the global north, at least in the conversations they have with UNESCO. And then, of course, the entire conversation about the digital public infrastructure, although it's present everywhere, the details of this conversation are also very different from one country to the other, from one region to the other.
Yes, I can certainly see that latter point that there is a more extensive time gap between those needs being met in advanced economies and those needs now being addressed in emerging economies, which is universal. I see this in the Pacific Islands a lot. Fen, you have your hand up, so
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation and how you're working with governments and various institutions. I wonder if you could, perhaps say a bit more about your support for academic institutions and teachers in building ethical safeguards, practical training, that strengthen human agency rather than replacing it, which seems to be a big concern right now. And, what opportunities in particular you see for UNESCO to engage that sector, not just in the global north, but the global south as well.
Thank you for the question. So there are two things here. In my functions here in UNESCO, the division I am the director, we work with academic institutions when they are involved in these two big areas that I'm in charge, that is the overall capacity building of the public sector or of the judiciary system. So obviously in many countries, you don't have a national school of public administration or government as you have in France, for example, the ENA and so on. So it is the universities that they do that, right? Schools of public administration in major universities. So several of them are also members of this Spark Alliance that I have mentioned earlier. And similar to the judiciary, some countries have national schools for training judges. A lot of them have, but some countries they don't have it. So it's the law schools and so on that do this kind of job. So then they are also part of our conversation in terms of the rule of law and AI. Now, if I understand your question correctly, what you have asked is more on the hands of my colleagues of the education sector of UNESCO, who are in charge of the daily conversation with the ministries of education in every area of education, from preschooling to higher education. So these colleagues are the ones trying to develop new curriculums based on the challenges of AI literacy and so on. We here in the sector I'm part of, although not under my division, we have also a global program on what's called media and information literacy that more and more is incorporating the AI challenges. But I do not give any false information or misleading. I'm not into the daily work with the education sector. I put here in the chat of this conversation, actually in early September, my colleagues of the education sector will organize a major week here in Paris that's called the Digital Learning Week. And as you can imagine, the bulk of the conversation this year will be about AI in the education sector, which is obviously a major concern from, again, education authorities, universities, and so on, all over the world. And my colleagues in the education sector are actually advancing a lot in this interaction with our member states and relevant stakeholders.
Thank you.
thanks for that. Is one of the things you mentioned in the presentation was the issues of multi diverse multilingualism in the face of LLMs. It'd be interesting to unpack that a little bit. We've had conversations both with you and also the GIDE community had quite a long conversation last year and in meetings in Rome and elsewhere on this issue of small language models for indigenous languages or other languages. The concern that I don't like using the phrase, but does massive digitization and LLMs equal with some form of cultural neo-colonialism again because major languages become dominant. What is it you hear and where do you hear it from? And what's different in the conversation according to where you're hearing it from?
Well, that's a great question. So I think there are different components of this conversation. So regardless, let's say the endangered languages or the least resourced languages, overall, there is a preoccupation, including from senior policymakers and decision makers, and this was very well reflected in the statements in Geneva a few weeks ago, and it's also a key component of the preliminary report of the scientific panel on AI, that the fact that these models are trained basically in a handful of languages might have serious implications in the output that they offer, right? Whatever it is, assessments, analysis, texts, and so on. And again, this is not even touching the fact that we have almost 8,000 languages still spoken in this planet, and we are not even getting close to include them in this kind of conversation. So I think there is one first preoccupation is what does that mean that these large language models are basically trained in very, very few languages? And what is the consequences in terms of what these models can offer, particularly in countries where it's relevant that the knowledge that is produced in local languages have an impact in policy making and so on. So this is one aspect of the conversation. The second aspect of the conversation is when we go to languages that are endangered because they are spoken either by very few people or even when they are spoken by a lot of people like Mayan or Quechua, etc., they are not present in a meaningful way in the way these models have been developed. So the question is how to do that while respecting the sovereignty of those indigenous populations. So the indigenous populations are actually thinking a lot about this, and is very much related to data governance policies, is that although they understand and they see the importance of having their languages being considered by these models, they don't think this should happen as a free for all. They want to be participating from the day zero of these conversations, right? So, and this is a very interesting point, which in the view of UNESCO should be fully taken into consideration, but adds a lot of extra complications in the way that these companies are treating these models and these data collections and so on. So here there is a strong conversation as we probably in this call and watching this video, we have been a lot the overall idea of data sovereignty, which is quite often applied in the context of the nations, but the indigenous populations are also speaking rightly so about their own data sovereignty in the relationship with these models. And then there are extra elements. For example, some of these languages, they don't even have their own scripts accepted by the way these models collected the information. So even if they wanted to do it, it's not that simple. So this is a second, let's say, pillar of the conversation. And the third pillar of the conversation that I found it very fascinating is these models, as the name say, they are language models, but it's not only that they are trained on the content that is available in a handful of languages. They were trained in a linguistic structure, in a grammar structure of few languages. And there is a very interesting research or philosophical question, if you will, here is what would happen if these models can also be trained in the grammar and linguistic structures of languages that have nothing to do, for example, with Indo-European languages and so on, which is, in my opinion, is a very fascinating conversation, including from the point of view of total business implication, right? Because they could actually advance to areas that are unknown just because the linguistic models that they understand or were trained are completely different of the possibilities you can find in the other 7,000 languages that are not being considered. So, in a nutshell, I think that the multilingualism conversation that may be in the outset of the internet was very much concentrated in the availability of content in different languages. Today is much more sophisticated than that. Content obviously remains an important issue, but is an issue of sovereignty, data governance, including the own potential further development of these linguistic models.
If I can take you further along that, beyond linguistic structure lies philosophy and mindset, and that's poorly expressed, but the way in which people see the world. And it strikes me, if one is to achieve non-bias in that incredibly important part of AI output or AI process, can we ever expect 3,000 of those 7,000 to have enough data to actually train a model to get enough data about the probabilities? If we continue to follow down a probabilistic AI model, will we ever have enough data that they can use? Well, how would you get enough data that you could actually train a model that's not just looking after grammar, but also reflects the different way of thinking about a particular problem or a particular question?
Yeah, I mean, probably not, but that's why also that maybe there is, by many stakeholders, there is an over exaggeration in betting the horses only in the large language models, right? There are interesting things happening on the sphere of small models, and some are even speaking about tiny models. So I think that, of course, it's unrealistic to think that all the 7,000 languages will have a space here for different reasons, including the ones that you just mentioned, which doesn't mean that there are not other ways of dealing with that, still using some of the advantages of artificial intelligence, but also recognition that these languages are not covered is an important one to not to at least to understand that we are creating new divides on this, right? Because you take, for example, the judiciary. Many courts are deciding to go fully digital, fully on AI, and so on, which might have potential positive implications for access to justice, reducing backlogs, and so on. But at least there is the need to have a conversation on how you don't keep excluding people that are not engaged with these systems for different reasons, including the linguistic reason, right? So I think the important thing is we as the whole of society approach need to be very clear that it's not enough only to be connected. The connection should be a meaningful connection. And part of this meaningful connection is also related the ability to interact with the systems in your own language. And if this is not happening, some sort of safeguard should be put in place. Otherwise, these communities will be totally excluded from important things related to the life in our collective societies.
Nick, you've got a question.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. It's been super interesting. I'm interested in training public servants, and one of the things you talk about is mitigating risks related to AI ethics and this inclusion in human rights and languages you've been discussing. But I was wondering, what are some other risks that AI use by public public servants could bring? What are some of these key risks that we're trying to mitigate by training public servants?
Thank you. Super interesting question. I mean, of course, the risks to the broader human rights agenda, they are from multiple angles, right? So we, as UNESCO, we don't have, for example, any specific mandate on health. This is something related to our colleagues of the World Health Organization. But regardless if the public servant is working for the Ministry of Health or Education or Environment or Human Rights or Defense or whatever it is, there are some elements, for example, related to privacy that are common ground that should be in whichever is your area of government, this should be on your span of attention. Either it is in procurement policies or internal regulations in a particular ministry and so on, because from police to hospital to airports, they are using facial recognition, for example, and so on. So our job is to look into these elements and tell to the civil servants in general, when you are dealing with AI policies, procurement, internal regulations, decisions on how you are going to reshape a particular policy delivery, privacy, for example, should be one of the issues that everyone should pay attention regarding these risks. Another important one that I mentioned is the issue of environmental impacts of AI, that again, you don't need to be part of the Ministry of Environment to be concerned about that. From urban decisions and these of regarding the data centers or whatever it is, there is a plethora of areas of government that will need to pay attention in these particular risks. And then, of course, there are specific discussions for about particular populations. The multilingual discussion here is one important one because you have in different countries. You take my own country, Brazil, right? Everyone looks to Brazil and say, oh, this is fantastic. This huge country, everyone speaks Portuguese. But Brazil has 166 indigenous languages that are not quite often in the radar of the conversations regarding Brazil. So how these things are featured into the conversation are particularly important. And then to not go too long on this conversation, there is the specific discussions regarding particular sectors, and some of them we go further because there are areas of mandate of UNESCO. So, for example, in the conversation with the judiciary, we are also very much interested in knowing how much the judiciary is keeping the final decision-making process to the judges and not to the machines, and what are the implications for a fair trial. So, for example, the risk here is how much the fair trial can be put at risk depending on the decisions that are taken regarding AI, for example. Right? We are also not looking into the risks. The overall conversation for us is how we can support the public sector to enhance and foster the opportunities that AI generates, and there are a lot, from analysis to access and so on, mitigate the risks, some of them we discussed it here, and eventually prosecute the harms, for example, related to children or elections and so on. In the risks, we are looking also into particular processes, for example, mega processes and crises like natural disasters or climate change, or processes like elections or health crisis. They are particularly impacted, for example, by the increase of in logic of disinformation and deepfakes, etc., generated by or potentially generated by these systems of artificial intelligence. So these kind of things are also part of the case studies in terms of the risk conversation, or even eventually the harms that we are including in this logic with the sector. And then final thing that it's very interesting is actually the public sector, including the National Schools of Public Administration, are concerned with a very important point, that is the future of the work of hundreds of different professions within the public sector with the adoption of AI. Right? So we are talking about the risks or the problems of AI for the workforce in general in the economies. But if you look into the public sector in particular, several professions in the public sector, they will be completely, if not disappear or reinvented because of AI. So this is a kind of conversation that we are also having under the umbrella of this Spark Alliance.
Thanks for that. One final point, well, perhaps we'll close with this one, and this is the question out of left field. You know, in Australian television, you always ask that last question, which is the different question. But inside the GIDE community, one of the things we've been very focused with this seminar series is that it's a multi-stakeholder approach, and that it includes trying to talk to private sector practitioners who also approach data governance from a sort of personal perspective and have actually they've put their capital at risk. They actually tried to build business models that are actually directed towards, you know, both doing the right thing, but also seeing whether they can make it work in a business sense. You've spoken a lot about the public sector today, and that's quite understandable for what you're tasked to do. But have you seen any examples in your work where you can think of where you've seen private sector actors who've come to the problems you're dealing with in an interesting way, in a dedicated way, or even in a critiquing way that would be interesting to note?
Sure. First, I mean, we also have this multi-stakeholder approach, and even when we are preparing these materials and our governance, let's say, recommendations to the public sector or to the judiciary, we always try to do that in also involving other stakeholders, the private sector, but also the civil society, the academy, the technical community. It's not always the case they want to participate in the conversation, but it happens. Particularly this discussion about AI and the environmental impacts, I'm seeing more and more an interest of the private sector in trying to understand how they can minimize or mitigate this impact and so on. Or one thing that, without naming names, for example, in the particular discussion of AI and multilingualism, I see all kinds of approaches in the private sector. Is that, which I think is the wrong approach, this idea that we are making a favor to these low resource languages communities. So we are putting these extra translations for them. We are using what capacities we have, and this is a good thing. So, and why I think this is wrong, because they think that this is enough, that it's not, the no need to involve the communities from the outset, to ask them in the first place, is this what they need and what they want, and so on. While other private sector big companies who understood that, and although it takes more time and so on, are really doing the thing in the right way, involving the communities from the very first day, taking the time to understand what they want. So I would say that there are also very good examples in across the border in the private sector in trying to do the things in a way that will have a meaningful impact, in the sense that the rights and the overall logic of this, for example, in this case of multilingualism of these different communities, are fully taken into consideration when developing these particular solutions for, in this case, low resource languages.
Great, that's insightful. You know, we can share names later. Well, listen, well, I'd like to say thanks very much for coming on and speaking with us. I know we've just touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of experience and the work that you and your team are doing, which is very important. And I know members who are on the call and others on the call may want to follow up, and we probably actually have talked about having a follow up on that legal one, because that's a space that'd be very interesting to explain. So we might make you one of the first people to come back and speak to us twice. And I'd like to thank everybody who participated. I'd like to thank people who was online. We seem to have had in this particular seminar a hiccup in the sending of what time this seminar started. Daylight saving seems to have confused the ghost and the machine, at least in some markets. So my apologies to those who came on an hour earlier and couldn't get on. But hopefully now you've seen the video. We look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.